and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this exciting lecture on All Hallows Day. This lecture is titled The First Ghosts, Most Ancient of Legacies. This lecture will be delivered by Dr. Irving Finkel. A little bit about our esteemed speaker for this day. Dr. Irving Leonard Finkel, born 1951, was trained in Assyriology by W.G. Lambert at the University of Birmingham. And from 1976 to 79, he was a research associate in the University of Chicago. He was then appointed as assistant keeper in what is now the Department of Middle East at the British Museum, where he reads Cuneiform inscriptions in Sumerian and Akkadian on ancient tablets from Mesopotamia. He also studies ancient board games and is the founder of the Great Diary Project, which rescues unwanted manuscript diaries for the future. He lives in London and has 5 children, as per his biography. A little offhand, informal introduction about how I came to know about Dr. Finkel. I met Dr. Finkel in 2015 at the CSFBS and at St. Xavier's College at the behest of our vice chair and my head of department, Dr. Anita Rani Kothare, wherein I saw the scholar, that is Dr. Finkel, translating cuneiform inscriptions, delivering a lecture on ancient board games, as well as a lecture on his published work that is The Ark Before Noah. And at that point of time, looking at his scholarly interests and his interest in a variety of subjects, the multifaceted person that he is, I said that I want to be like Dr. Finkel. Maybe I've reached 1% with the hair, and we'll carry on from that. But today's lecture, let's delve into what we are going to hear today. The belief in ghosts takes us back to the very beginning, wherein, as Dr. Finkel suggests, the experience of ghosts emerges as a central concept of humanity since its very inception. From cuneiform tablets in ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian dating from around 3400 BC, Dr. Finkel will be unlocking the most ancient of ghost stories ever written. Ancient spirit wisdom of how to live with ghosts, how to get rid of them, and the very philosophical questions of what are ghosts? Why are they so integral to this human experience? And what do they tell us about being human? Are some of the questions that Dr. Finkel will be unraveling through this lecture. And on behalf of our co-hosts, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya, its trustees, Director General and staff, the Museum Society of Mumbai, its chairperson, its executive and its members, and all of our audience gathered today, I welcome Dr. Finkel to deliver this lecture. Last but not the least, I extend my gratitude to the technical team, Hridaya Vaidya, Mrinalini Sampath, Sanjana Ratnaparki, and Yashraj for handling today's session. And I also thank Dr. Anita Rani Kothare, our Vice Chair, who will be giving the vote of thanks and handling the Q&A at the end of the talk. So ladies and gentlemen, sit back, relax, and enjoy this spooky evening with the scholar Dr. Finkel. Ancient Ghosts, the Most Ancient of Legacies. Here we go. Dr. Finkel, the screen and the slides are all yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your introductory remarks. Right. Right. Well, as Jason has explained, my title, The First Ghosts, Most Ancient of Legacies. And it is true that I am a cuneiform scholar in the British Museum. I'm a curator in London. And could we have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. Right. Well, my job in the British Museum is to read these most ancient kind of inscriptions on clay tablets, like the one in front of you, from ancient Mesopotamia. So you see it is made of clay, and the writing goes from left to right, and the writing is pre-alphabetic, very ancient indeed, dating to originally before 3000 BC, maybe 3500 BC, and the writing is effectively syllabic. It is not alphabetic, but the words are written in syllables. And it is from documents like this clay tablet that we find out all about the ancient world of Mesopotamia in the most startling way. So could we have the next slide, please? So this is a helpful map to start us off, because the terrain from which these tablets originate is what we call today Iraq, but the ancient name from the Greeks was Mesopotamia. And this Mesopotamia, or in modern terms Iraq, is the territory defined by the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. It was a very fertile part of the world. You can see on the map, it's surrounded by Syria, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. But it is that area, modern Iraq, where many things began for the first time, and writing itself originated as far as we know. Next slide, please. So when I say that writing originated in Mesopotamia, we know all about it from remarkable discoveries which come out of sites which look like this one. So it's a rather arid scene, it's a rather arid photograph, but you can see against the horizon there's a small mountainous structure. This is an ancient tell mound, which marks a spot where people lived continuously for many thousands of years. And it is true in antiquity as later that people tend to live in the same place for obvious reasons like water, protection, defense, and so forth. And the result of it often is that thousands of years of deposit are there for the archaeologist. And when people excavate these ancient sites, they find buildings and gates and walls, pottery, objects, and if we're lucky also, cuneiform inscriptions on pieces of clay. Next slide, please. So the ancient population of Mesopotamia divides into two basic groups by language. So on the left, you will see a stone sculpture from about 2600 BC, a long time ago, of a Sumerian priest who has a shaved head and large eyes and large ears. He was supposed to be receptive to messages from the gods above. And he spoke the language we call Sumerian. So Sumerian is the oldest language recovered by archaeology, written in cuneiform on clay tablets. And the curious thing about Sumerian is that it has no modern relative as a language, because as everybody knows, you have ancient languages like Sanskrit, and then modern languages like Hindi and so forth, which are strongly related to them, the same family. And if you learn one of them, it's not so difficult to learn another. But with the case of Sumerian, there is no relative, either ancient or modern. It stands on its own. So that's a Sumerian person. And to the right, you will see a wall painting, an ancient wall painting of an Assyrian person. And he's writing a tablet. He has his stylus in one hand and the tablet in the other. And he is shown writing a tablet. And his language is what we call Akkadian. Now, Akkadian is quite different from Sumerian, and it has many modern relatives, even though it is also extinct. So if you know, for example, Arabic or Hebrew or Aramaic or Syriac or Ethiopic, any of that family of the Semitic languages, then if you take a look at texts written in the ancient Akkadian language, there are many things which are straight away familiar. So we have one strange isolated language and the other more familiar language, and they are both written with the same kind of writing on clay tablets. So when you find a clay tablet for the first time and you look at it, you start to read the signs, you have to decide whether it's in Sumerian or in Akkadian. Next, please. So these are a couple of cuneiform signs which I thought I ought to show you. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, there is a very long, complicated sign, which, if you analyze it, consists of horizontal and vertical and diagonal impressions. They are wedge-shaped impressions. And this is a drawing of one, but on a clay tablet, the signs are pressed into the clay in this style. So this upper left-hand corner is a long sign, which is the ancient cuneiform sign for ghost. So in the Sumerian language, this is pronounced Gedim, as you can see here. Gedim is the Sumerian term for a ghost, and the Akkadian term is Etemu. And if we had a Sumerian or an Akkadian speaker in the room and they saw that sign, they would go, oh, gosh, it's a ghost. But the thing is interesting to point out that Gedim and Etemu are really the same word, and that the Sumerian word is loaned into the Akkadian language. Like in modern speech, for example, in English, there are lots of words loaned from French and other sources. Languages borrow from one to the other. And in ancient Mesopotamia, the older Sumerian words were sometimes borrowed into Akkadian and slightly softened or rounded off, like here. So this is the word for ghost, the yellow sign ghost. Now, if you look carefully, you will see that that big sign can be broken down into components. So I've drawn on the lower part 2 vertical and 1 horizontal wedges all together, which are the fraction 1/3. And this big sign is a mixture of the fraction 1/3 plus 2 other signs, which you can see in the middle, Ish and Tar. And they are phonetic signs which together spell the name Ishtar, which means 1, the very famous goddess of love and death and war and everything else, Inanna or Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess. But it also means a female goddess in general. And so when you look at this sign, you see it consists of the fraction and the word Ishtar, and this is what it means: 1/3 female divinity. So when they had the sign created for a ghost, this is a very diagnostic matter, because it meant that there was flesh and blood and the inner spirit, as we would call it today, which they conceived of as being of feminine divinity, was 1/3 of the 3 components. So this sign contains within it a clue to the theological or philosophical view of what a ghost is. It's the 1/3 component of a human being which survives the body after death and goes somewhere, as we know. The one on the right is the sign for demon. And in ancient Mesopotamia, it was very important to remember that ghosts and demons are not the same, because ghosts are the remnant of a human being. And because of this fact, most ghosts were regarded as being somehow accessible, that somehow one had a bit of sympathy with them if they came back and troubled you. But the thing on the right, the one I've done in red, which is the word udug or otuku, that means a demon. And there you have a 2/3 fraction instead of a 1/3 fraction. And these demons are very, very different. They are extremely dangerous. Nobody knows where they come from. Nobody knows what their makeup consisted of, but they could never be killed. And they were merciless killers and tormentors. So if you are an ancient exorcist using cuneiform writing, dealing with clients who are ill or unhappy, you have to find out whether it is a ghost that's causing the problem or a demon. Next slide, please. Well, I'm going to show you a couple of demons, not to give you a sleepless night, but to convince you of something important, that when you study ancient religion, ancient magic, ancient fears, and ancient people's minds, it has to be remembered that it's not just an inert, dead thing like this stone amulet on the left, which shows the dreaded demoness, female demon called Lamashtu, who was believed to prey on pregnant women and new babies. And this amulet was to be hung up on the wall of the bedroom where the woman was lying, and it shows this lion-headed demoness holding snakes and suckling dogs and pigs and things, riding on a donkey. They were very, very frightened of Lamashtu, and it personified the danger that attended childbirth in antiquity, as it still does in many parts of the world. And people were very nervous when their wives were going to have a child, whether the wife and the child would come through in one piece. So there was a lot of magic against this Lamashtu to banish her, to throw her away. And on the right, this rather upsetting picture comes from the modern mind of somebody on the internet who has drawn this painting. And when I found this picture, it seemed to me, goodness me, it somehow goes with this ancient matter and shows really what people thought. It wasn't just a flat figure in a piece of carved stone, but it was real. It was to do with real fear and life and death. And this ghastly figure crouched over the poor woman is a kind of modern coincidental imagination of this ancient demon. Next slide, please. Oh, let's skip this. Next slide, please. That's not really relevant. Next slide. Okay. So we've seen enough of demons, I think, because what we're really interested in here is ghosts. So I've translated on the screen two important texts into English, which give you quite a good idea of a lot of things at once. So at the bottom, just to remind ourselves that we're talking about the dead who are buried, sometimes with bits and pieces. You can see here, this is an archaeological photograph, because this was the idea that when a person died, they were buried as soon as possible for obvious reasons. And the body lay in its grave, and the essence of the person, what we will call, say, its spirit, their humanity, their inner thing that made them an alive person, went down to the underworld, below the earth, where they were supposed to stay and not come back. But what actually happened, according to these ancient cuneiform tablets, is that sometimes they did come back for one or other reasons. And it is that issue we have to consider. So on the left, we have a short spell, which is the sort of thing that people, I think, muttered or spoke out clearly when they saw a ghost, when they didn't expect to see a ghost. These are the sorts of things they said. You are the offspring of the wind. I've laid you in the grave. I've sent you down. Why did you not fear my solemn oath? So this is written in cuneiform writing in the Akkadian language on a tablet from 3,000 years ago. But you can see in the translation, there's a kind of feeling of you've been let down, you've done your duty, the ghost is supposed to be there and not come back, and nevertheless, here he is. So why didn't you do as you were told, is the first question. And then the second inscription is a bit different. It's the equivalent of, in modern terms, what we might call a tombstone, but they didn't have tombstones as far as we know in antiquity with writing on above the grave. This perhaps was on a tablet buried with the body in the ground. And it says this: if ever, a long time from now, far into future time, in the days to come, anyone should find this tomb, may he not clear it away. May he restore it. May that man who finds this not despise it. Rather, he should say as follows: this tomb I shall certainly restore it. And may the favor he does be requited him. Above, may his omens be propitious, and below, may his ghosts drink pure water. So this tells us quite a lot, that people were very worried that with the passage of time, their grave will disappear from sight and be forgotten, and they don't want that to happen. And this thing about omens being propitious is very much to the point, because in ancient Mesopotamian society, a lot of effort was devoted to trying to predict the future on the basis of things that happen. So an obvious matter is, if you're having your breakfast and a lizard runs across the rafters and falls on the table, then that's a very ominous matter, and the experts knew what it implied, and they would know the kind of magic that would have to be enacted in order to avert the danger. And among all these hundreds and hundreds of documents to do with these omens, there's a whole group to do with ghosts. And they're very systematic, because they say, if a man sees a ghost on this day of the week, this week of the month, this month of the year, and if the ghost is somebody he knows or somebody he doesn't know, if he's wearing clothes that you recognize and you don't recognize, if it's somebody you know, it's somebody you don't know, if it's your uncle, if it's, and there are hundreds of lines, each one saying a specific thing about seeing a ghost. And many of them have a kind of danger attached. And the idea was that the professional person, if someone had seen a ghost and was very upset and sought help to get rid of it, would ask questions so that they could use this list of descriptions to find out what kind of ghost it was, who it was likely to be. Because if you could establish who it was, you're probably better qualified to get rid of it easily. And the thing about may his ghosts below drink pure water is very much to the point, because in the descriptions of the underworld, we know this: that water was at a premium because the ghosts lived off clay and water, not a very nice diet. And there were parts of the underworld where there was good, clean water, and parts of it where there wasn't. It was rather grubby. So there's a bit of dissatisfaction about it. So the whole idea here, operating both above and below, is that the person who rescues this tomb, when he is a ghost, he will have good supplies of pure and probably cold water. Next slide, please. Yes, right. Now, on the left, you have a very famous literary tablet called The Descent of Ishtar. And the Descent of Ishtar concerns this goddess who is carved in clay on the plaque next to the tablet. And we know she's a goddess because she has a special headgear, and she's holding the symbols of life. She has wings, and she's accompanied by lions and owls. Now, the thing is this: you might notice she hasn't got any clothes on. And in ancient Mesopotamia, as a general rule, portrayal of the nude female form was very unusual. And here we have a goddess without any clothes on at all. So this is an important point. Now, in this tablet to the left, there's a narrative about how Ishtar, this goddess, is very unhappy because her lover, called Dumuzi, who went down to the underworld for reasons of his own, has been captured there and not released. And Dumuzi was the shepherd god, and if he doesn't come up, then none of the flocks would reproduce, and there'd be sterility everywhere and starvation, and he was very necessary for the role of the seasons. And if Dumuzi was away, everybody was full of lament. So Ishtar decided to go down to the underworld to rescue her lover, who was being held by Ereshkigal, who was her own sister, who's queen of the underworld. So this is what happened. Now, if you look at the next slide. Yes, thank you. Right. Well, this is a schematic drawing by me. It's not an ancient thing at all, but it's to give you an idea about this story. Because you see at the top, the line across, that's the earth. And there is a ziggurat drawn there, which is the temple tower of the Babylonians, a very famous thing, and a palm tree just for effect, and the sign that says Kutha, because Kutha was a real city in southern Iraq, one of the most important city, where in ancient times, when the Babylonians and Assyrians were around, so in second and first millennia BC, the entrance to the underworld, according to these people, the Akkadian speakers, was in the city of Kutha. So in the story about Ishtar, that's where she goes, and she has to go down this long meandering path to the great hall at the bottom, where she will confront her sister and plead for her lover. Now, in the story, there are 7 gates, and the goddess had to go through each of the 7 gates one by one. And each time she went through, she had to remove an item of clothing. And she's rather surprised at this. So when the first gatekeeper says, "My lady, you must remove your frontlet or some part of your clothing," she says, "Why? I don't know why this is." And he said, "Oh, it's the local custom." So she did. And by the time she got to the bottom, she had no clothes on at all. And that's why she looks like the picture on the clay sculpture I just showed you before. Happily, she manages to rescue her lover, and all is well. It's a rather dramatic story. Next slide, please. Hello? Right, thank you. Right, so let's imagine this. We live in ancient Mesopotamia. We live in our house, say in 1800 BC. And the way things operated at that time were as follows. Say you were a comfortable merchant, a prosperous sort of normal family. In general, a father would like to have as many sons as possible, perhaps 4 or 5. And when the sons grew to manhood and they got married, then the wives would be imported into the family house, and they would live on the family estate, as it were, on this big complex, have their own children, So you'd have a kind of family all living together, and the architecture would be all built around a central courtyard. Now, in many periods of Mesopotamian history, when a person died, they were buried under the courtyard in the house like that. Sometimes they were just buried in a mat. Sometimes there was even a vaulted structure beneath the ground where successive members of the family would be laid to rest. So they were there. So this is an important matter to understand because, for example, if the father died, the oldest son had a special responsibility which weighed on them rather tiresomely. So imagine your father's buried under the courtyard, everybody knows where he is, and there's a kind of tube set in the ground where offerings of water and food had to be made on a regular basis because they had a kind of conception, half literal, half symbolic, that the dead needed this sustenance in the netherworld. So it's a complicated thing because on the one hand, they knew that the body was under the ground, and if they poured things through there, that's where it went. And they also knew that the spirit of the person was deep in the underworld, which was very, very far below, and probably didn't get the material. But it's not a sort of thing you could ask a sensible question. Like if we had a Babylonian person, you couldn't say, well, look, why are you doing this? Do you really think that? It doesn't work like that? As you, I'm sure, understand yourselves, this is on a deeper kind of level where it's a responsibility, a symbolic responsibility. But the thing is this, if the oldest son or his deputy doesn't do this job, doesn't regularly supply, the ghosts get cross. And when ghosts get cross, they come back to complain. And one of the biggest reasons for ghosts to come back was just this thing, that their rights had been impugned. They were not getting what they were entitled to. There were no offerings, and people have forgotten all about them, and they didn't like that. And they thought they would come back and get on people's nerves and pull their hair and be altogether unpleasant until they got what they wanted. Now, the thing is this, you can imagine clearly that if someone is buried under the courtyard where it's surrounded by all the family housing and where everybody lives, that when the ghost came back, he would hang around there. That would be perfectly natural. He wouldn't go on a boat to America. He would live and hang around in the family where once he had been in charge. So this is the thing. You're making a salad, let us say, cutting up the vegetables peacefully, humming a tune, and suddenly, goodness me, you see a ghost of some ancestor, maybe somebody you don't recognize, in the room with you. So what happens? You jump like anything or very startled, and you think, what a nuisance this is. I'm going to have to do something about it. And what a pain. So this is the thing. When ghosts appeared once, people thought nothing of it really, because the world in which this operated, these Sumerians and Babylonians and Assyrians who spoke these two languages and lived in this culture, they had a life which I don't think is so difficult to understand, where nobody said to anybody else, I believe in ghosts or I don't believe in ghosts. There was no dispute about this question. It was a whole different framework. Everybody in the country, everybody in the culture took ghosts for granted. They were part of daily life. And in my view, this is the default position in humanity at large. We can come back to that in a minute. So the situation here is, let's say you see a ghost and you see it 2 or 3 times, it's beginning to get on your nerves. You go down to the market and you find the place where the tablet writers operate. And you get them to make you one of these amulets. So you can see it's made of clay. And there's a hole all the way through, so you would thread it on a string and put it around your neck. And it's addressed to the god Marduk, the big famous god of Babylon, god of magic. And it says, this is a spell of Marduk. Ghosts, do not keep appearing to me. And you wear that around your neck, and the ghost, when it comes in, sees this and is overpowered by the magic of the great god Marduk and decides, I'm going to get out of here while the going is good. So if you have one of these and they both have the same inscription, that is the first step to getting rid of a ghost who suddenly appeared out of the blue. And what is interesting is this, that in the Akkadian language, in which this is written, there is a special form of the verb which means to keep doing something. You can't do that in English. You have to say to keep doing, but the actual verb itself has this quality. So when you read it, you can tell that the person has been visited more times than they're really happy about, and actually they've had enough. And it's that kind of rebellion, like when you have a toothache, eventually it's so bad you go and get someone to deal with it. Next slide, please. So that clay amulet is a cheap thing that you could get very quickly from someone, like in the market, as I said, and hopefully that would be enough. But among the world of amulets, there were much more classy things, much more expensive, and no doubt much more powerful. And this one here is such an example. It is made of obsidian, kind of volcanic glass, which you don't find in ancient Iraq, in Mesopotamia. It had to be brought in from Afghanistan or some place like that. Very costly material, very hard and difficult to carve. Now, there are words on here which I've written in 4 colors for fun. The words go Zizig Nuedesh, Sagish Luabdash. And if you study the Cuneiform languages and you know Sumerian and Akkadian, these words are very strange. They don't seem to make any sense. They don't sort of correspond to any well-known vocabulary, and they've got all these sh sounds as well. So I know that this was an amulet against ghosts. And when I was thinking hard about it and trying to explain it, I suddenly realized what was going on here, because they had 4 words in Sumerian, and instead of spelling them like normal or doing them in a faithful way as the words are pronounced. What they did is they kind of dressed them up to make them sound ancient. They kind of ancientified the words. So I've written at the bottom that Zizig is among living things. Then do ye not come up, like in Old English, when you now say do you, do ye tells you already it's like from Shakespeare or Chaucer or a long time ago. Raise thy head, ye corpse. So I have tried to extract from these manipulated words the meaning of what it was, and it fits, of course, to get rid of the ghost. So this is a very interesting matter, because the idea of the magic behind it is not just simple, straightforward, go away, but the words have been made to sound like they're very hoary from antiquity. They've been successful for many, many thousands of years. These magic words are the stuff you need. And the ghosts will think, oh gosh, it's one of these very ancient spells. Again, perhaps we'll be off. And the other thing is that the writing on the obsidian is itself also archaic. So this amulet was carved in about the 9th century BC, but the sign forms on that object are done in imitation of signs from about 2,000 years before. So they've made ancient looking writing and ancient sounding words as a really powerful thing. And you wear this around your neck, on your chest, and you would feel quite safe. Right. Now, one other thing I have to show you, this I think is quite marvelous. You see this very small clay tablet. It is written in Sumerian, and it's dated to 2042 BC, quite a long time ago. And what it says is the following, that the man called Zimzilach, you can see, who was an Elamite dog warden, has been given a dead donkey at the city of Dreichem in southern Iraq, what we call Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia. So this Elamite is the name for people in antiquity who came from modern Iran, from Persia. They were called Elamites in 2000 BC. And the thing is this, in Elam, in ancient Persia, there was a special kind of very ferocious mastiff that was a common animal. And the thing is that the rulers of the cities in Mesopotamia, the Sumerian rulers, who were responsible for a whole city, they imported over the border these very fierce dogs with their handlers, because probably none of the Sumerians could deal with them. So this Zimzilach was on the staff of a Sumerian city responsible for the dog security. And the dead donkey was probably lunch for one of his dogs or a few of his dogs. Now, the thing is this, Zimzilach is an Elamite name. Now, in Mesopotamia, they were very systematic about wages and looking after people. And there were often tablets with all the names of the people who were supposed to get their dues at the end of the week and how much they got. And this is what must have happened. Follow this carefully. There must have been in antiquity somebody who dug up a tablet with a list of all the Elamite dog people in one piece. So there were perhaps half a dozen of these chaps, all of the dog people systematically in one column. And so at a later period, somebody found an ancient tablet when they were digging themselves in one of their cities, found this tablet with these funny names on, and nobody knew what they meant. They weren't in Babylonian, or they weren't in Akkadian, they weren't in Sumerian. What on earth were they? And one thing led to another, and eventually this group of names from some such tablet passed into the hands of the ancient magicians, because they thought that Zimzilach, you didn't know it was a name, they thought it was a magic word. And so there are many amulets that have this line on like this, Zimzilach, Zichilach, Chuchlach and Chuchtila, those 4 names are actually the names of 4 Elamite workers from an earlier period. And somebody thought that this was powerful magic that would drive ghosts away like nobody's business. And so there are many amulets that have on them these 4 words, sometimes spelled a bit differently. So in another one, instead of Zinzilach, it has Zibshilach. And instead of Zichilach, it has Numelach, and so forth. And you can see at a glance that the 4 lines, which represent 4 ancient names, have gone from tablet to tablet and amulet to amulet. And because nobody knew what they meant, they got distorted. They got changed, like when you whisper to a person a word and they whisper it to the next person, and by the time it comes back to the beginning, the final sentence has nothing to do with the original sentence. And this is a bit the same. It's not quite so drastic, but the situation here is that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are from 4 different magical texts against ghosts, and the people who wrote the inscriptions thought these words were really powerful magic terms to affect their dispersal. So this is what we in modern times call abracadabra or mumbo jumbo. It's the same principle. All magic systems rely on meaningless or unintelligible words which sound marvelous, exotic words from other places, to be the heart of magical spells. So this is, in fact, this Zimzilach Zichilach thing is the first example of mumbo jumbo in history. But on top of that, as well as being a normal thing for magicians, the most remarkable thing is that for many centuries, they copied these signs, these words, with no idea what they meant, but carefully valuing them, because that is what mumbo jumbo is always like. But in this case, we know what the words mean because they are just names like Tom, Dick, Harry, and Will in English. And imagine if somebody from the moon found a piece of paper with Tom, Dick, Will, and Harry on it. They, gosh, this must be a piece of magic from the world below. We'll use these words and they'll become sacred, powerful words. And it's very remarkable that not only can we find mumbo jumbo in use for the first time, but we know what the words mean, even though they didn't. It's rather ironic. So we've seen a cheap amulet, and we've seen an expensive amulet, and we've seen a remarkable amulet. But if that didn't work, then what you had to do was to go to an exorcist, a professional specialist, and explain that, well, I've got this problem and I want you to help. And this is a quotation from one of the tablets where the rubric, which I put in yellow in the middle, is the title which the scribe who wrote it gave it, which is Incantation Against Constantly Seen Dead Persons. So we have an incantation and then a ritual. So the incantation is a bit like what we've seen before. Dead persons, why do you keep appearing to me? So that's what it says in that amulet. You whose cities are ruin heaps and are mere bones. I will not go to Cutha, which, if you remember, is where the entrance to the underworld was, the ghost's assembly point. I will not go. So you can imagine that the picture in the mind here is that a ghost has come and is troubling a person, and they go, oh, come with us, and you say, I'm not going. So that's that. You are conjured away by the Queen Abatu, Queen Eresh Kigal, who is Ishtar's sister, and the late Queen goddess Nin-Geshtin Anna, who is the scribe of the gods, whose stylus or writing stick is of lapis and carnelian. So this is a threat you see, that the queen will be cross with them, the queen of the underworld, and her scribe, who notes when people are not, or rather ghosts are not where they're supposed to be. If they're not there, she makes a little note on her tablet, absent, and there'll be trouble ahead. So this is a kind of spell to slightly bully and persuade the ghost to go away. And then there's a special ritual which it says you open up a pit towards the setting sun with a bronze spade, and you throw ditch water and some roasted grain into an ox horn. Then you have to char over the fire some other material and stir it into the liquid. Then you recite this incantation, dead persons, why do you keep appearing to me? And then pour the water into the well. So it will go down into the underworld with its magic components, which will have the right effect. And then there's a censer and torch waved in front of the afflicted person. So this is not a very complicated ritual. And in fact, it's rather comparable to many such things, not only from ancient Mesopotamia, but elsewhere as well. The sort of simple magical procedures are not particularly unusual. Now, this is something more exotic because this is a modern drawing, of course, it's not an ancient drawing, but the thing is, in about 1600 BC, a scribe wrote down a tablet with a long ritual for getting rid of a ghost, which prescribed making this thing. So you get this reed, you strip off the leaves, and you make a kind of doll with arms, as you can see, and a dress and a mop of hair. And all the details are quoted in the cuneiform in such a way that Daniel Schremer, the Assyriologist who edited this text originally, was able to draw from the description this remarkable series of stages in how to do it. It's a kind of dolly, so to speak. Now, the ritual is interesting because it is a man who is afflicted by the ghost of a woman. And so what happens is that the man's wife is sent away and he has to have a banquet with this dolly at the table with food and drink. And then afterwards, he's to sleep with this dolly in his own bed as if it were his wife. And then ultimately, the figurine is buried, rather like in the other one, by the setting sun, and is supposed to go away and go back to the underworld and leave the person alone. So he kind of divorces the doll who takes away the entity of the unwanted female visitor. So this is quite an elaborate thing. And there are two possibilities, perhaps. One, it is just a female ghost who's come into the house. That is one thing. But a more human idea might be, for such a complicated idea, that the man in question, who is married now, had a wife before who perhaps died or ran away and was never seen again, but whose presence in the house was sensed by the wife number two. Perhaps the husband was always talking about her or reminiscing or something irritating like that. But in the house, this woman, this first wife, perhaps dead wife, was still present. And it might be that this specific complicated ritual had that special component. It was to banish this unwanted special case of a female visitant for good, because the real wife, the living wife, was really fed up with it. And I think one could understand how that might be true. Now, if you have that drawing of the dolly in your mind, I just wanted you to see this tablet, which is written in Babylon in about 600 BC. And on the left, there's a drawing in the clay. I hope you can see that it's a woman. She has bobbed hair and her arms are outstretched like this. It's a figure of a woman mounted on a stick, on a pole. And this figure is the same kind of idea as the doll in the ritual I just showed you, but it's much, much later on in time. And this is a complicated ritual to get rid of ghosts, because when you went to sleep, they had the idea in Mesopotamia that when you were defenseless, really nasty ghosts, because there were quite a lot of nasty ones as well as the normal ones, would go in your ear, because you can't cover both your ears and breathe very easily in bed. So they thought this was a vulnerable portal. And when the ghosts went in there, you were in big trouble, because they would drive you crazy in your head. They would affect your lungs and breathing. They would affect your inner organs. And so really dangerous ghosts who did that sort of thing were very, very seriously taken. So in this ritual, the drawings serve for an exorcist to make these models to install at the head of the bed, where the patient who has had ghost trouble or is fearful of it is going to sleep. So this king, this kind of ancient sage on his throne, which is what is actually depicted there, sits at the head of the bed, and this other thing on a pole with the hands outstretched spins. So the exorcist, or whoever is watching over the person, flicks one of the hands and the thing spins round on its spindle, and it's a bit like a scarecrow. Probably it went or something like that, and the ghosts who were hanging around, looking around for trouble, would be sent away like birds in a cornfield. Same kind of idea. Next slide, please. You'll have to look here very, very carefully. I'm sorry, because this tablet has a bit of writing at the top and a bit of writing at the bottom, and in the middle, a drawing. Can you go back? Yes, we'll have to talk about this without the benefit of the drawing. Now, please be patient, because this is not fair, because we had a lovely illustration. So in the area between the two lines of writing, there is a drawing which shows a tall man with a beard in a long coat with his hands held in front of him. Perhaps you can just see the figure standing with the arms outstretched in front. And in front of him, you can hardly see it. It's heartbreaking. There is a drawing of a woman. You see where there's a gash in the clay, done carelessly by whoever excavated it. To the right of the gash, you can see the woman's head, and she's standing, walking along. At the bottom, you can see her foot. She's striding forwards, and she has the end of the string, which is tied round the hands of the man, in her grasp. So the way it operates is she is leading this figure off. Now, on the other side of this tablet, there is a long inscription which describes, to get rid of a troublesome ghost, in this case a man, that the exorcist or the apprentice is to make a figure of this, of the ghost, who is going to be led away to the underworld by this woman. Now, this is not what we normally do in this kind of circumstance, but I wonder whether this will in any way be helpful. I'm heartbroken, you can't see the picture, but here, is that in any way visible, Jason? Can you see?
I'll put you on full screen if you can give me a second.
Yes.
Yes.
It's very important.
Now we can.
Yes.
Now we can see it.
So, if it's in focus, you see that the tablet. What we did with the computer is to draw in white over a photograph, the same photograph, the figure of the man and the woman. Can you see? So he's a tall old man with a beard in that humble position with his hands being led off by the woman. So the thing which is so important about it is this. That is a drawing of a ghost. That is a picture of the ghost, which the practitioner would have to make a picture of the woman, and she would take him off to the underworld and live happily ever after. So this is an important thing, because it's a complicated matter. The professional makes these figures, tells you how to dress them, what they need to wear, and then she takes him off, and that's the end of it. So the analysis here must be that there is an old man ghost in the family, and the exorcist, as I said, does a kind of diagnosis. Can you describe this man? Well, he has a beard, he's very thin, he's very tall. What else do you know about him? Well, It might be Uncle Henry, because Uncle Henry couldn't go 2 days without female company. And maybe that's why he's upset in the underworld, because he's looking for love. And so the well, this is a good solution. So you make a model of this uncle, whoever he is, and a woman to take him away, to be modeled in clay and dressed according to the inscription. Now, this is quite an extraordinary thing. It's quite sweet in a way, because they have to live happily ever after, as you can imagine. But the thing which is so marvelous is that this is the oldest drawing of a ghost in the world. We know it's a drawing of a ghost, and no one can argue with it, and there's no rival for an earlier drawing ever possible. So this was done in about the 5th century BC, something like that. And if you look at the next slide, you will see the triumph that this has led to. Because this tablet, you see here, Imran, my dear colleague, wearing his special blue gloves, has this tablet in his hand. And this gentleman here is the editor of the Guinness Book of Records. And this tablet is now in the new edition of the Guinness Book of Records as the oldest picture of a ghost ever discovered. So a small piece of clay, which no normal person would look at twice, is now in the Guinness Book of Records. I think this is quite remarkable. And we have this special certificate to prove it as well. So don't forget. Right, next slide, please. Oh, lovely. Yes, this is a very handsome looking tablet. It's broken, you can see. Bits have been joined on. And in this whole topic of getting rid of ghosts, of dealing with ghosts, interacting with them and so forth, the primary job of the professional is to get rid of them, to pacify them, to try and give them what they need if possible, because they had very clear reasons in their minds why ghosts do come back. They made lists of them. So apart from being cross about the offerings, there were other conditions which weren't so easy to deal with. If a human being died under very gruesome circumstances before their time, like in a fire or in a battle, or fell down a well, or run over by a chariot wheel, or any other gored by a bull or something like that, those sorts of accidents, they bury the body, but the spirit would sometimes be very restless. It didn't have its final this or final that. They had unfinished business, and the unfinished business is very often the sort of motive which drives ghosts to come back to claim attention from human beings. And that is why I think in Mesopotamia, people were on the whole sympathetic to ghosts, because they felt they had a kind of good reason. Of course, it wasn't always like that, because there's a very interesting text which says that the ghost is the spitting image, is the best translation in English, the spitting image of the person. In other words, if you were a weak and feeble, shy person, your ghost would have the same characteristic. And if you were ebullient and noisy, then your ghost would be like that. And if you were crafty and mean, the same thing. And if you were a psychopath or a Nazi or the worst kind of human being, then your ghost would have the same qualities. And it's the ones at the far end, the really horrible ones, who made the most horrible illnesses. So they were an extremely serious matter. And in fact, the hand of the ghost is the medical term for a large number of inner ailments, which were really conceived because the ghost kind of possessed the person. It got in them and had to be driven out rather complicated ways. However, apart from all this exorcistic driving ghosts off, there's a small number of texts which is just the opposite, where you want to bring up a ghost from the underworld into your company so you can ask them questions. So this is what is known by classicists as necromancy. So you bring up the spirit of the dead, and somehow it is believed that the dead person knows the future, and I don't know how that would be, but they know the future, and also that they're going to tell you the truth. And I don't know how that can be either, because not all people tell all people truth all the time. So getting a ghost up from the underworld to ask it something is a kind of tricky thing. The second thing is this: how you did it. This manual tells us a lot of meaty material. You have to get a skull. And I'm fairly sure that if you wanted to speak to a specific person, then if it was somebody in the family, for example, your great grandfather, because of the burial system which was common, it might be possible to retrieve the skull for this purpose if it was a really serious matter, and it would have to be. So the exorcist came, you can imagine, dressed in long robes with things hanging from the belt and probably straggly hair and long fingernails and a frightful looking person. I don't imagine they were fat and plump with a big smile, but just the opposite. And you get one of these people to do this operation. So you have the skull. And the idea is that the skull is the vehicle for the dead person to come up, go in the skull and communicate. So to compel this ghost to enter the skull, you have to recruit the help of the sun god, Shamash, who was the judge and also in charge of the underworld, because every night when the sun set, he went under the world and he went all the way through the underworld and then came up again all the way through the heavens. So he knew all about what was going on, and it was him, the judge, who would force the ghost in question to come up and do this job. But the right spell had to be pronounced, and on top of it, the skull itself had to be anointed with a mixture of very unpleasant things in oil. So this is what happened, with a lot of hanky-panky and no doubt incense and all that kind of thing, muttering and what's the word? Manipulating the fingers in special way and spelling out the spell in order to impress the client. But you have to imagine how that would be with all that going on with hello, looks like the ghosts have interfered. Yes, with all that going on, with a skull in front of you like that on the table. Imagine it in the night. You've been driven by some extremity actually to do this, but if you can imagine, it would be a very heart-beating kind of thing and a very frightening kind of thing. And if you heard a voice, if the teeth suddenly went, or you heard something like that, you probably have a heart attack yourself. So I think this was a very serious thing to do. And it is interesting that the manual, that tablet, which gives instructions, not only tells you how to get the ghost into the skull to answer the question, but also how to get rid of it afterwards very effectively. There are lots of magical things. Go back, go back, go back, because you don't want to bring the ghost up and have it wandering around all over the place, disturbing people. So that's part of it. So you might think this is bizarre. You might think it's perfectly reasonable, but we know that quite a lot of specialists did this kind of work. But not only do we have that instruction, there is a very remarkable letter from the Assyrian capital in Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal, who was going to be king, when he was a young man, he was not the crown prince. His older brother was crown prince. And Ashurbanipal wanted to be king of Assyria, king of the whole world, for certain. So when he was still in that humble state, he got the court exorcist, probably in the dead of night under the palace when no one was there, to do an operation like this, to get his dead grandmother to come and answer the question, will I be king of Assyria in due course? Because he was her favorite. And apparently the queen mother, the grandmother, came back and gave him this message, and in due course he did become king of Assyria, king of the world. So this thing on that tablet is not just an esoteric matter in the shades, but this kind of thing happened. And that letter is the remarkable testimony. Next thing, please. Yes, this is a painting, a modern Victorian painting of an episode in the Bible when King Saul, who was about to be defeated by the Philistines, was in a parlous, terrible state, and he wanted to find out what was going to happen. And so he went to a lady called the Witch of Endor in order to get her to call up the prophet Samuel. Now, you remember perhaps that there were prophets in that world who spoke the words of the Lord to the population, and Samuel, who was a very famous prophet, had died. And King Saul, nevertheless, wanted to consult Samuel. So according to the Bible, he went up the mountain to this lady, who was called the Ghost Mistress, to ask her to bring Samuel up so he could ask him what was going to happen. This is written in the Bible, as plain as can be. And what happened was that Samuel indeed came up. And this is the romantic painting shows the shrouded figure supposed to be Samuel, and the king Saul holding his head in panic. And Samuel, when he came out of the ground, didn't say, "Oh, hello, Saul, how are you?" Or, "I got news for you, I'm afraid." All he said was, "Why did you disturb me?" This is a very remarkable thing, because if you read this text in the Bible, in English or any other language you read it in, what is so remarkable about this story is it's described in a very matter-of-fact, realistic kind of way. And Samuel, the dead prophet, tells the king, "It's all over, you're finished." And he goes back down to the underworld beneath. And this witch of Endor, who was responsible for bringing him up, the king is about to go down the mountain with his two assistants, and she insists on giving them a hot meal before they go. So it is the most extraordinary story to read it, because it stands out as if written by somebody who was there, and the whole matter of bringing up a dead prophet to ask is taken perfectly for granted. And what is so curious is that in the Old Testament of the Bible, almost all references to magic and demons and ghosts are all squashed down. They were regarded as abominations. But in this particular passage, you have something which is a close echo of what happened in Mesopotamia, that it was completely taken for granted that ghosts could come up and communicate with you if necessary. Right, so I've got two more slides to show you to finish off this talk. So the voices that have come down to me written on these clay tablets, as I say, show clearly that at that time in the world's history, the populations of the ancient Middle Eastern world took ghosts for granted as part of their everyday life. It wasn't a matter of belief or disbelief as it is in the modern world. And I have a theory that this acceptance of the existence of ghosts is the default position for the population at large, and that is the reality of the matter, that belief in ghosts is kind of worked into human psychology and has been for an unimaginable amount of time. And in defense of this, I show you this skeleton, which is not Homo sapiens, which is what we are, but a Neanderthal skeleton, because as you know, before Homo sapiens emerged as the species we are today, there were lots of earlier hominids and hominins, and then a very close parallel to Homo sapiens was the Neanderthal. And archaeology has very recently made great inroads in finding evidence about the Neanderthals, which show they have a slightly larger brain than Homo sapiens, and that they buried their dead in prepared area, folded up neatly, sometimes with objects. And my thesis is the following. If a population buries its dead in the ground when they are dead, they do it because otherwise it stinks. Otherwise it's unbearable. And if they had a disease, it's very, very dangerous. And so human beings bury their dead jolly quick. But of course, so do some animals. So burial of the dead in itself is one thing. But if you bury the dead with bits and pieces, jewelry, a little object, a little tool, then inevitably the implication is that the belief is that when the body disappears, some part of that creature, some part of that entity whoosh, comes out and goes somewhere. Because otherwise you don't put things in the grave, especially if you can't afford them, they're useful to you and profitable. The only reason you put them in there is because you think that the dead will need them in the world to come. So burial on its own is burial. Burial with things implies to me an understanding of an afterlife of some kind. So I therefore believe that the Neanderthals already had conceived that some part of a human being survived when the body didn't, probably because it's intolerable for the species, either them or us, to believe that when one is dead, that's the end of it. No one has been able to believe that. All the religions of the world have this idea that something survives of a person, and I think it goes back to the dawn of the species. So it is hardwired into us from the very beginning of time. And therefore, I am courageous enough to take on a fencing match with the proposition that all human beings really and truly, underneath everything, whatever they may say, believe in ghosts, because I don't think you can possibly avoid it. Now, of course, there are lots and lots of scientists, and scientists know better, and they only want evidence, and they only want facts, and they want repeatable experiments. And so scientists say things like this: I don't care what you say, I'm never going to believe in ghosts, they just don't exist. So in the modern world, it's a matter for dispute between people who've jolly well seen a ghost and they know jolly well they exist, and people who've never seen a ghost, or they're scientists and they say they never exist, and then people in the middle who don't know. That is the modern world. It's divided into these three camps. But as I say, this is a perversion of the original default position, and I think it's a consequence of the twin arrivals of monotheistic religion on the one hand, which were very dominant, and science. And religion and science make people who have seen ghosts unwilling to talk about them, although I know a large number of people have the most remarkable stories. But until we can convince the scientific community, we're stumped. So I have a proposal in my last slide. Right, now this property is in England, in Yorkshire, and you can see the state it's in. And this is my proposal. Is one of the Yorkshire moors. My proposal is this. We wait to the height of winter and we invite 15 or 20 Nobel Prize scientists to a party in this house. So they all turn up, and there's lots to eat, and there's especially lots to drink, and there's a rambunctious party that goes on into the small hours of the morning, when eventually all these scientists, one by one, stumble up what remains of the staircases, find a wet, damp mattress in one of the rooms, lie down on it, and go to sleep in their nightshirts. So when they're all deep asleep and snoring, what I'm going to do with, I think, a few helpful volunteers is go round the back of the house with a long ladder. And we lean the ladder against one of the windowsills and quietly go up the ladder until we can stand at the top, and in front of one of the broken windows, we then do this, put our hands like this, and we go, ooh, like that. And all the scientists in their different wet, damp bedrooms will all sit bolt upright in their bed, in their nightshirts, and they will all wet themselves in panic. That is my conclusion. Thank you.